When Emily's father passes away, his will leaves everything to her, sparking a bitter family feud. Her brother Scott and mother conspire to steal her inheritance, forging documents and draining the estate of everything her father worked for. But their betrayal is only the beginning. Fueled by grief and anger, Emily digs into their lives and uncovers dark secrets, illegal schemes, stolen charity funds, and a shocking truth about her own identity. As she seeks justice, Emily's quest for revenge reveals scandalous twists that leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about family, loyalty, and herself. Will justice bring her peace, or will the truth destroy her forever? I've always been the quiet one in the family. Not shy, not antisocial, just different. While my brother Scott basked in the spotlight, straight A's, football trophies, a dream job in a luxury car dealership, I was content to stay in the shadows. I wasn't a failure by any means. I had a decent career as a graphic designer, lived modestly, and kept mostly to myself. But to my family, especially my mother, none of that mattered. In their eyes, Scott was the one to be proud of, the one who carried the family name. I was just there. Growing up, I never resented it. I figured that was just the natural order of things. Some people shine, and some people support from the sidelines. My dad was the only one who seemed to truly see me. He never compared me to Scott, never made me feel like I was less than enough. He'd take me out to his garage and teach me how to change the oil on his classic cars, or we'd go fishing on the weekends and talk about anything and everything. It was during those moments that I felt special, like I actually mattered. When he passed away 2 years ago, it felt like a piece of my soul was ripped away. I wasn't ready to lose him, and neither was my family. He'd been the rock we all leaned on, and without him, everything started to unravel. It wasn't long after his funeral that the lawyer contacted us about the will. Sitting in that sterile office, listening to the faint hum of an air conditioner, I couldn't have imagined how much that moment would change everything. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze, unfolded the document with an air of finality. My mom sat stiffly beside me, her lips pursed in an almost permanent frown. Scott lounged back in his chair, looking smug and confident, as though he already knew what was coming. Your father made it very clear in his will, the lawyer began, his voice steady but authoritative. He wanted the entirety of his estate to go to Emily. For a moment, there was silence. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what he'd just said. The house? The savings? The garage full of cars? All of it, to me. My dad's voice echoed in my mind, soft and reassuring, "You deserve more than you think, kiddo." Scott broke the silence with a sharp laugh, the kind that's half disbelief, half outrage. "That's got to be a mistake," he said, leaning forward. "There's no way Dad would leave everything to her." The lawyer raised an eyebrow but remained professional. "There's no mistake. Your father was very specific in his wishes. He left a letter explaining his decision, which I will now read." I couldn't breathe as the lawyer opened a small envelope and began to read aloud. My father's words were simple but heartfelt. He explained that he wanted me to have a safety net, a chance to live comfortably without worrying about money. He mentioned how proud he was of me, how he admired my quiet resilience and hard work. I felt tears welling up as the words sank in. He'd always believed in me, even when no one else did. But Scott wasn't moved. His face twisted with rage as he slammed his hand on the table. "This is insane. Dad must have been out of his mind when he wrote that. He was probably sick or confused. There's no way he'd do this to me, to us." He shot a glance at my mom, who nodded in agreement, her lips thinning even further. "Emily," my mom said, her tone icy, "you know this isn't right. Your father loved all of us, not just you. He must have been pressured into this. The fair thing to do is to split it equally." I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not about fairness. It's about what Dad wanted." But they didn't care about what Dad wanted. They cared about the money, the house, the cars. They cared about what they thought they deserved. Over the next few weeks, they tried every tactic in the book to guilt me into giving up the inheritance. Scott called me selfish and ungrateful, accusing me of taking advantage of Dad's illness. My mom played the martyr, sighing dramatically about how disappointed Dad would be if he could see the family torn apart like this. I held firm, but it wasn't easy. Every interaction with them felt like a battle, and I hated conflict. I hated feeling like I was the bad guy for simply honoring my father's wishes. But I refused to back down. This was the one thing my dad had left me, and I wasn't going to let them take it away. Then, one day, I noticed something strange. A letter from the bank arrived in my mailbox, addressed to the estate of my father. It was a notice about the mortgage on the house. Confused, I called the bank to clarify. That's when I learned the truth: the house had been mortgaged in my father's name, after his death. Someone had forged his signature on the documents. My blood ran cold as I pieced it together. Scott and my mom had gone behind my back, filing false documents to contest the will. They claimed my father wasn't of sound mind when he wrote it, and in the meantime, they'd begun liquidating the estate. The savings account was empty. The cars were sold. They'd even taken out loans against the house. Everything my father had worked so hard to build was gone. I confronted them, furious and heartbroken, but they didn't even try to deny it. Scott shrugged, his expression cold and unapologetic. "You weren't going to do anything useful with it anyway," he said. "This way, we all get what we deserve." "What we deserve?" I repeated, my voice shaking with anger. "Dad trusted me with his legacy, and you stole it. How could you do this?" "Grow up, Emily," my mom snapped. "This is how the real world works. You're lucky we didn't cut you out completely." That was the moment something inside me broke. I'd spent my entire life being the quiet one, the one who avoided conflict, the one who let things go. But not this time. This time, they'd gone too far. They didn't just steal from me, they desecrated my father's memory. And I was going to make them pay. I didn't know how yet, but one thing was certain: they had underestimated me for the last time. I spent days reeling from their betrayal, my mind trapped in a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and crushing despair. Every memory of my father, every moment of kindness he'd ever shown me, now felt tainted by what they'd done. My family had turned my grief into a weapon and used it against me. But I wasn't going to let them win. After the initial shock wore off, I started to think clearly again. If they were willing to go to such lengths to take everything my father left behind, then I needed to fight back just as fiercely. Sitting quietly and hoping for justice wouldn't cut it. They had forged documents, stolen money, and wiped out the estate, all while assuming I'd be too weak or too scared to do anything about it. But they didn't know the side of me I was about to unleash. I started small. I gathered every shred of paperwork I had from the estate, the original will, the bank statements, even old utility bills from my father's name. I spent hours cross-referencing the dates, looking for discrepancies, and piecing together the story of how they'd pulled off their fraud. It was slow, grueling work, but with every piece of evidence I found, I felt a growing sense of determination. The more I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Scott had spearheaded the entire scheme, using his connections and charm to file false claims with the courts and manipulate the legal system. My mom had been his accomplice, signing off on everything and pretending it was all for the good of the family. Together, they'd systematically dismantled everything my father had built, all while I sat in the dark. I couldn't go straight to the authorities, at least, not yet. I needed more leverage, more proof. So I turned my focus to Scott. I knew my brother well enough to know he'd have more skeletons in his closet than just this inheritance scam. He was always the type to cut corners, to bend the rules if it benefited him. If I could find something big enough, something undeniable, I could take him down. It started with a little digging into his professional life. Scott loved to brag about his job at the luxury car dealership, where he managed high-end sales for an exclusive clientele. But something about his stories never quite added up. He'd mention flipping cars on the side for extra cash or making connections that no one else could. At the time, I'd brushed it off as harmless exaggeration. Now, I wondered if there was something more sinister behind it. Using the contacts I'd built during my design work, I reached out to a former coworker of Scott's. His name was Aaron, and he'd been fired from the dealership under murky circumstances. I didn't know if he'd want to talk, but I figured it was worth a shot. When we met at a small cafe downtown, Aaron was nervous at first, glancing around like he thought someone might be watching. But when I explained what Scott had done to me, and hinted that I was looking for justice, his demeanor shifted. "Look, I don't want to get involved," he said, stirring his coffee anxiously. "But, yeah, your brother's shady as hell. He was running all kinds of scams while I was there." "Like what?" I pressed, my heart pounding. Aaron sighed and leaned closer, lowering his voice. "He'd forge paperwork on trade-ins, inflate invoices, stuff like that. The worst was the VIN swapping. He'd take a car that had been wrecked, swap out the VIN with one from a clean title, and sell it like it was brand new. He made a killing doing it, but if anyone found out..." I didn't need him to finish the sentence. Selling cars with fraudulent VIN numbers wasn't just unethical, it was a felony. If I could prove it, Scott wouldn't just lose his job. He could go to jail. I thanked Aaron and left the cafe, my mind racing with possibilities. I knew I needed hard evidence, something that would hold up in court. That's when I remembered the storage unit. Scott had rented it years ago when he first started working at the dealership, claiming he needed a place to store extra inventory. I'd always assumed it was full of tools or spare car parts, but now I wondered if it held something more incriminating. Breaking into the storage unit wasn't easy. I spent hours researching lockpicking techniques online, practicing on an old padlock I found in my dad's garage. When I finally felt confident enough to try, I drove to the facility late at night, my hands shaking as I worked the lock. It clicked open after what felt like an eternity, and I pushed the door up, half expecting to be greeted by an alarm or a security guard. Instead, I found rows of shelves stacked with boxes of car parts, tools, and, bingo, folders full of documents. My heart raced as I flipped through the papers, my fingers trembling with adrenaline. There it was, a detailed paper trail of Scott's illegal activities. VIN swaps, fake titles, even receipts for under-the-table cash deals. He hadn't just been bending the rules, he'd been breaking them left and right. I took as many photos as I could, careful not to disturb the arrangement of the papers. If Scott noticed anything missing, he'd know someone was onto him. I slipped out of the storage unit undetected and drove home, my mind buzzing with a mix of fear and excitement. I finally had the ammunition I needed. But Scott wasn't my only target. My mother had played her part in this mess too, and I wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. She ran a small charity in town, one she loved to brag about during family gatherings. She claimed it was her way of giving back to the community, but I'd always suspected it was more about appearances than genuine generosity. Now, I wondered if there was more to her charity than met the eye. I started by looking into the charity's financial records, which were surprisingly easy to access online. What I found confirmed my suspicions: irregularities in the expenses, vague line items that didn't add up, and deposits that seemed to vanish without a trace. It didn't take long to figure out what was happening. My mother had been skimming money from the donations, funneling it into her personal bank account. She'd been stealing from the very community she claimed to serve. The betrayal cut deep. She wasn't just my mother, she was supposed to be a pillar of the community, someone people could trust. But just like Scott, she'd let her greed consume her. I filed away the evidence, knowing it would come in handy when the time was right. For now, I needed to focus on Scott. He was the bigger threat, and taking him down would be my first step toward justice. I spent the next week preparing. I contacted the authorities anonymously, providing them with all the evidence I'd gathered about Scott's illegal car flipping operation. I included detailed records, photos from the storage unit, and even the information I'd gotten from Aaron. The investigator I spoke to seemed intrigued, asking enough questions to let me know they were taking it seriously. Then, I waited. Each passing day felt like an eternity, the tension building as I wondered when, or if, they'd take action. But when the knock finally came on Scott's door, it was worth every sleepless night. I watched from across the street as two detectives escorted my brother out of his house, his face pale and furious. He shouted something I couldn't hear, his voice drowned out by the sound of his front door slamming shut behind him. For the first time in my life, I felt a flicker of power. Scott wasn't untouchable. He wasn't invincible. He was just a man who'd finally been caught in his own web of lies. The day Scott was taken into custody was the first time I felt like I could breathe in weeks. Watching him hauled out of his house, his arrogance shattered, gave me a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. But I knew this wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Scott was only part of the equation. My mom was still out there, untouched, and if she thought she could sit back and let Scott take the fall while she slithered away unscathed, she had another thing coming. After Scott's arrest, the local news was flooded with headlines about his crimes. Luxury car manager arrested in fraud scandal, one article read. Another went into more detail, exposing his illegal VIN swapping operation and the false invoices he'd used to line his pockets. It didn't take long for his dealership to release a statement condemning his actions and cutting all ties with him. Scott's golden child image was officially dead. But as satisfying as it was to see him publicly disgraced, I knew he'd bounce back if he had the chance. Scott was a master manipulator, and he'd worm his way out of trouble if it meant saving his own skin. I had no doubt he was already plotting his defense, likely trying to pin the blame on someone else. So, I made sure to keep feeding the investigation. I reached back out to the detectives, anonymously this time, and shared even more evidence I'd uncovered from Scott's storage unit. Old emails, receipts, and even copies of contracts he'd altered. I didn't want to leave any wiggle room for him to escape. If he thought he could claw his way out of this mess, he was in for a rude awakening. But Scott's arrest also had another, unexpected effect. It put my mom in a panic. She called me the day after his arrest, her voice tight and clipped. "Emily," she said, "I need to talk to you. This whole thing with your brother is a misunderstanding. He's not a bad person. You know that." I almost laughed at her desperation. "A misunderstanding?" I replied coldly. "He's been committing fraud for years, Mom. That's not something you just misunderstand." Her tone shifted, growing more accusatory. "Don't you dare take that tone with me. He's your brother. Family sticks together, no matter what. You should be helping him, not kicking him while he's down." "Helping him?" I repeated, my anger boiling over. "Like how you helped me when you stole Dad's money? When you forged his signature and drained the estate? Tell me, Mom, where was this loyalty to family when you decided to destroy Dad's legacy?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. "Emily, you don't understand. I didn't have a choice. Your father's will wasn't fair, he wasn't thinking clearly when he wrote it. Scott and we just did what we had to do. You didn't have a choice." I snapped. "You always have a choice, Mom. And you chose greed. Just like Scott." I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, a mix of anger and sadness coursing through me. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. Despite everything, she was still my mother. But then I reminded myself of the people she'd hurt, the lies she'd told, and the money she'd stolen. She wasn't just my mother, she was a criminal. And she needed to be held accountable. With Scott out of the picture for now, I turned my attention to her charity. The more I looked into it, the more sickened I became. My mother had been running the organization for years, presenting herself as a selfless do-gooder who wanted nothing more than to help the less fortunate. But the financial records told a different story. I found discrepancies everywhere. Donations that never made it to the charity's official bank account. Checks that were deposited into her personal account instead. Inflated expense reports for events that never happened. It was a textbook case of embezzlement, and the worst part was how many people she'd duped into trusting her. I knew I couldn't take her down alone. This wasn't just a family matter anymore, it was a community issue. So, I reached out to a local investigative journalist named Kate, who had a reputation for exposing corruption. I sent her everything I had, financial records, bank statements, even a list of donors who might be willing to talk. It didn't take long for Kate to reply. "This is big," her email read. "Can we meet in person? I want to make sure everything checks out before I move forward." We met at a quiet coffee shop a few days later. Kate was sharp, direct, and clearly experienced in handling stories like this. As I walked her through the evidence, I could see the wheels turning in her mind, already piecing together the narrative. "This is enough to launch an investigation," she said after we'd gone through everything. "If what you're saying is true, your mother's been stealing from this charity for years. Once the story breaks, the authorities will have no choice but to step in." Hearing those words sent a chill down my spine. This was it, the moment I'd been working toward. But it was also terrifying. No matter how much she'd hurt me, my mom was still my mom. Exposing her would destroy her reputation, maybe even land her in jail. Was I really ready to do that? I thought about my dad, about everything he'd stood for. He'd been a man of integrity, someone who valued hard work and honesty above all else. He would never have condoned what my mom had done, and he would have wanted me to do the right thing, no matter how hard it was. So, I gave Kate the green light. The exposé ran 2 weeks later, and it was brutal. The headline alone was enough to make my stomach churn: local charity head accused of embezzling thousands. The article detailed everything: the missing funds, the fake expenses, even testimonies from former employees who'd suspected something was off but hadn't been able to prove it. By the time I finished reading it, my hands were shaking. The fallout was immediate. Donations to the charity dried up overnight, and my mom was forced to step down. She issued a public statement denying the allegations, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but no one believed her. The community turned on her quickly, and it wasn't long before the police opened an official investigation into her finances. For weeks, my phone rang non-stop. Scott, calling from jail, demanding to know if I'd had anything to do with his arrest. My mom, leaving tearful voicemails begging me to help her. Even distant relatives, furious that I'd betrayed the family. I ignored them all. I didn't owe them anything, not after what they'd done to me. But even as I watched their lives fall apart, I couldn't shake the emptiness in my chest. I thought revenge would feel sweeter, more satisfying. And while there was a certain vindication in seeing them finally face the consequences of their actions, it didn't erase the pain they'd caused. It didn't bring my father back, or undo the damage they'd done to his legacy. Still, I wasn't finished yet. There was one final piece of the puzzle I needed to resolve: the court case over the forged will. It was time to reclaim what was rightfully mine. The day of the court hearing arrived, and with it came an overwhelming sense of dread and anticipation. This was it, the final chapter in the battle for my father's legacy. My lawyer had reassured me repeatedly that we had an airtight case. Between the forged signatures, the fraudulent loans, and the blatant theft, Scott and my mother didn't stand a chance. But something in my gut told me it wasn't going to be that simple. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet hum of whispers as I took my seat. My mother sat across from me, her face pale but composed. She looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of everything she'd done was finally sinking in. Scott, on the other hand, was nowhere to be seen. Still in jail, I assumed, though his absence didn't make the tension any less suffocating. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. My lawyer presented the mountain of evidence we'd gathered: the forged documents, the timeline of the estate's dismantling, the fraudulent transactions. Piece by piece, he dismantled their defense, painting a clear picture of their greed and deception. My mother's lawyer tried to argue that she'd acted out of desperation, that she'd only wanted what was fair, but it was a weak argument at best. The facts were undeniable. When it was finally my mother's turn to speak, she rose shakily to her feet, clutching the edge of the table for support. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling, "I'm not here to deny what I've done. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I did it for my family. For my son, Scott." She looked directly at me then, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Emily, I know you hate me for what I've done. But I need you to know that it wasn't just about greed. It was about protecting you, from the truth." A chill ran down my spine. "What truth?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. The room fell silent as my mother hesitated, her gaze darting nervously between me and the judge. Finally, she took a deep breath and said the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew. Your father wasn't your biological father, Emily. I froze, the air knocked out of me like I'd been punched in the gut. The words echoed in my head, nonsensical and impossible to process. What are you talking about? I managed to choke out. It was a long time ago, she said, her voice breaking. Before I married your father. I had an affair with another man, someone who couldn't be part of our lives. Your father knew, Emily. He knew the truth, but he loved you like his own anyway. He wanted to protect you, to give you a chance at a better life. I stared at her, my mind reeling. This had to be a lie, a last-ditch effort to manipulate me, to throw me off balance. But there was something in her eyes, something raw and desperate, that told me she was telling the truth. My lawyer leaned over, whispering something about staying calm, but his words barely registered. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. And what does that have to do with stealing my inheritance? I demanded, my voice rising. What does that have to do with any of this? My mother's tears spilled over now, streaming down her face. Your father knew Scott would contest the will. He knew the family would turn against you. That's why he left everything to you, Emily, because he wanted you to have something of your own, something no one could take away. But I couldn't let Scott lose everything. He's your brother, Emily, even if you don't see it that way. I did what I thought was right. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My hands clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms as I tried to process what she was saying. All my life, I'd felt like the outsider in my family, the odd one out. And now, I finally understood why. I wasn't truly one of them. My father, the man who had loved me, who had believed in me, wasn't even my real father. The judge cleared his throat, his expression stern but sympathetic. While this revelation is certainly dramatic, he said, it does not excuse the fraudulent actions taken by the defendants. This court will now move to a ruling. I barely heard the rest of the proceedings. The judge ruled in my favor, of course, ordering the return of what little remained of the estate. But it felt hollow, meaningless. Even as my lawyer patted me on the shoulder and congratulated me, all I could think about was the truth my mother had dropped like a bomb in the middle of the courtroom. After the hearing, my mother approached me in the hallway, her face lined with regret. Emily, she said softly, I know I've hurt you. I know I can never undo what I've done. But please, understand. I loved your father, and he loved you. He wanted the best for you. That's all I ever wanted too. I stared at her, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and confusion. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her she had no right to talk about love after everything she'd done. But another part of me, a small, quiet part, felt something else. Pity, maybe. Or exhaustion. I wasn't even sure anymore. You didn't do this for me, I said finally. You did it for yourself. For Scott. Don't pretend this was about protecting me. She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she nodded and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I sold what little remained of the estate and moved to a new city, far away from the memories and betrayals that had consumed me. But the truth about my father lingered, haunting me in quiet moments. I couldn't stop wondering who my real father was, or if it even mattered. The man who had raised me, who had loved me unconditionally, was the only father I'd ever known. And maybe that was enough. As for Scott and my mother, they faded into the background of my life. Scott was sentenced to several years in prison for his crimes, and my mother's charity scandal left her a pariah in the community. I didn't hear from either of them again, and I didn't try to reach out. One day, as I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, I came across the letter my father had written to me, the one the lawyer had read after his death. I unfolded it carefully, the familiar words bringing tears to my eyes. Emily, I know you've always felt like the outsider in this family, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've got a kind heart, and that's worth more than anything I could leave you. No matter what happens, stay true to yourself. In that moment, I realized something important. My father had always known the truth, and it hadn't changed the way he felt about me. He'd chosen to love me anyway, to leave me everything he had, because he believed in me. And no matter what my mother or Scott had done, they couldn't take that away from me. In the end, I didn't need revenge to feel whole. All I needed was the memory of a man who had loved me unconditionally, and the strength to move forward, knowing I was enough.